people that are from our previous years. We have some great stalwarts around who've been supporting this program year on year over the past 10 years or so. So good to have you all here. Colleagues, obviously we've decided to shrink and change the program. We're here in virtually in Brussels and Belgium, as opposed to being in Zagreb. And rather than have a full day, we're going to have this one session on inequalities and the impact of COVID-19, the virus, if you like. The circumstances we find ourselves in are the most bizarre. I don't think any of you or any of us, I think most leaders in the world have ever experienced this kind of context. I don't think anyone is prepared and understands what it is to manage, respond, and provide a sense of confidence in the context of this kind of global emergency. It's the first one since, I think, in peacetime history, in terms of its global reach and the fact that it's shaking not only our faith in leadership, but also it's completely creating an economic meltdown in a way that we never anticipated. And I suppose what we want to discuss today is what will that do to what we already understand to be the inequalities in the world? We know currently what the facts and figures are in terms of who owns most of the wealth in the world and who has the least. And our speakers will contribute to that, and I won't go into some of the data. But this is really trying to understand what the impact will be and what kind of things are people doing in response to this emergency that tackles the sharp end of the impact, which is those communities and people who are going to suffer the most due to their material circumstances, their educational circumstances, their housing circumstances, and a whole range of others in terms of where they live also, in terms of their kind of urban poverty, if you like, spatial poverty. So there'll be a whole range of issues, I think, here that are going to affect communities in a way that we're not talking about, because I think we're thinking about population-wide impact, and every morning you have that harsh reality. It's almost like a ticker. How many more people are infected? How many more people are dead? And it's almost become this ridiculous, nullifying, numbing experience where you think, my God, really? Has it gone to that extent now? And are we losing that many people? And I suppose in that, I think it behoves us to kind of pull back a little bit and think about what kind of responses do we need to make? And what do we need to think about as a community of European young leaders in terms of what role, if any, we can play collaboratively? I don't imagine we'll come up with solutions. If we do, that's fantastic. But I do hope we come up with ideas, because without ideas, we wouldn't have social progress in this world. So let's hope we do come up with some good ideas about what can happen. So I want to kick off. So if you're all clear about what needs to happen, I want to kick off with our first contributor, Sebastian. Sebastian's a good friend of the house. You've come to many of our debates and spoken eloquently. Sebastian, give us, from your perspective, your take on the situation, and you're a technocrat, if you like, to a certain extent. You know data, you understand big data. Tell us from your perspective how the data revolution or the data context helps us in this environment, but also some of your thoughts and reflections as, like others, you've been probably mesmerized and also shocked and bewildered by what's been happening on a day-to-day basis. Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dharmendra, and it's a pleasure to be back at Friends of Europe. What I'd like to do in my very short introduction is just share some specifics on how technology is being used today to combat the coronavirus. Quickly, so my background is I'm a tech entrepreneur. For the last 9 years, I've been working on telecom big data, and we've worked on data for good use cases, combating epidemics such as Ebola, Zika, or malaria. And so in this introduction, what I'd like to do is focus on 3 questions. Quickly remind you how epidemics spread, how telecom data can help to combat such a disease, and basically give you a quick preview of what's happening in Belgium, because there's something very exciting that is actually going to be announced today.
That's good. Thank you. Excellent.
Yeah,
a bit of good news, I hope.
The press release is going out any minute, so I've turned my phone off to avoid the journalists. But so exciting times. since time is of the essence, I'm just going to jump into it right away.
Please.
So how does, like COVID-19 like become a pandemic? It's quite mathematical, actually. Like it's an infectious disease that has a relatively high basic reproduction number. Like although the statistics vary, the consensus is that one infected individual is going to contaminate anywhere between 2 and 3 additional people. Everyone that's done a bit of maths knows that this translates into exponential growth. This has been widely documented in the press, so I'm not going to go further. But you've seen on Twitter this hashtag trending around how do we flatten the curve. From a public health perspective, to combat an epidemic and to flatten the curve, like officials can act on various dimensions. They can build awareness, they can set guidelines for health professionals, they can target infectious clusters, they can limit movement. We've been hearing a lot about like social distancing. And these actions, they can be applied across the board, like in a mass perspective, or they can be targeted to those who have a higher risk of propagation of the disease, whether it be individuals with high risk, individuals with high mobility, or targeted at individuals who have a higher risk of dying if they're exposed. And that's where you've seen a whole set of targeted measures, for example, around hospitals or retirement homes. But to take these actions, you still need data, and that's the biggest problem that we're confronted with today. There's not enough data, there's not enough accurate data, it's not current enough. And that's where we bring in telecom information. Through your mobile phones, location data is collected systematically. And so this information can be anonymized and aggregated, respecting all of our European values around privacy. And by extracting the insights from your individual mobility and aggregating it at the level such as your municipality, your postal code, well, you can support public decision makers in the actions and decisions they need to make to combat the disease. I'm just going to give you 2 examples. So today, the Belgian government, or last week, has enacted a national containment measure forbidding non-necessary movements. And there's a legitimate question behind that. Is it proportionate? Does it work? Well, with telecom data, we can compute mobility maps that measure the evolution of mobility over time. And this feedback is essential for governments because it allows them to have a quantitative answer and confirm whether the measures are producing the desired effect. And this is quite trivial or logical, which is reduced mobility means reduced contact between people. Since the epidemic is transmitted person to person, hopefully the reduced mobility will translate into reduced propagation of the disease. This hypothesis has already been demonstrated in China, for example. There's a second use case where the coronavirus crisis cell needs to predict where the epidemic is likely to spread. When you overlap incidence data, so where infected people reside, for example, and you overlap that data with the mobility maps that I just referred to, then you're able to produce a probability, a prediction of whether an area is going to be affected, yes or no. And this work is produced by experts, special spatial epidemiologists. And so in Belgium, what has been amazing is that we were able to secure government support. So we've been able to secure mobile network operator support and data protection authority support within 1 week. And we're going to be able to dig into these details in the Q&A, but I'm proud to share that we're going to be able to preserve your privacy and get the information needed for effective decision making. We're going to be publishing our first results on Monday already. And that's basically my governing thought is this shows how scalable technology is. Few people can impact continents, with technology. And my hope is to demonstrate how tech can be used for good, how data can be used against coronavirus, And that's it for me, Damendra. Thank you for the attention.
Sebastian, it's always a pleasure. You're always so, but you're entrepreneurial, but also entrepreneurial with a social purpose, which is great. And it's good that you've come up with another great idea. And it'll be interesting to see what people's reactions are, because there's a lot of what you've just said is almost combining the kind of responses and reports we've had from Singapore in terms of tracing, but you can see there's a mixture of human communication, police officers, health officials, and using some sort of digital data to be able to do the tracing. But what you're proposing is something completely different. Is that right? To the Singapore model. I just want to confirm that for the rest of our people in the group.
Yes, and you can really see this as, well, what data do you use? Do you use it at an aggregate level, or do you use it at an individual level? In China, for example, they're notorious to have really acted at an individual level.
That's right.
And basically, whoever you touched, wherever you were, if you were infected, became a high-risk area. And so they were working on individual data and producing individual action. What we're demonstrating is saying, you know what, individual, that's too high a cost versus privacy today. We can respect privacy and get the insights at an aggregate level, for example, at municipality level, and act at that level. During the Q&A, I do expect people to ask questions on how do you ensure privacy? Is it effective? And you see, those are basically the two dimensions that are fighting each other. And so where I'm proud is that we found that balance that respects the privacy and delivers value.
Yeah, so I suppose the other bigger question is that you're producing data and evidence. It's a case of whether that will lead to politicians and politics moving in the right direction and making the right choices. On that, Alexandre, I mean, those of you who want to come in, as I said, remind you, please make sure you raise your virtual hand, okay, so that I know who wants to come in. Alexandre, I want to bring you in, if I may, because where you're sitting, it's been one of the biggest tragedies in Europe. Both in terms of numbers, but also the political response from member states. It's been a tragedy of what the European Union's about, and it's, when it mattered, the values just literally were shattered. And I can imagine how it must have felt sitting there thinking, actually, where is France and Germany? Where is the Union in terms of emergency supplies, financial support, etc., and so forth? Do you want to just give us a reaction to what it feels like from your point of view, and also whether this model that Sebastian is describing has any bearing on any reactions that are taking place in Italy? Over to you, Alessandro. You're going to have to unmute.
Sorry. I'll try to stick to what Sebastian was saying, because otherwise, we will have to discuss this for ages. And there are plenty of things going on in Italy at the moment. And we are considered to be we are the major case in Europe so far. So the question is whether we are just anticipating things that are happening elsewhere, and the reaction in other countries from governments mainly will follow suit. There are two questions. There's one question I wanted to ask to Sebastian, and one comment I wanted to make. What's going on in Italy at the moment is very complicated because we decided to have in basically 1 week 3-4 decrees taken by, not even by the government, but taken by the prime minister. So even in an even more restricted approach. And basically we ended up by locking down all the country. Starting with the Lombardy region. And what we are witnessing at the moment is that basically this situation seems to be quite under control in many regions in Italy, but it's not under control in the Lombardy region, which is quite surprising for us, because Lombardy is considered to be, to be frank, the most advanced region in the country in terms of health system, in terms of capacity and ability of the people to follow governmental and local authorities' rules, etc., etc. There is one argument that is coming out over the last few days about the fact that there is a different approach in terms of hospitalization in that region that may have impacted on the fact that the COVID-19 is spreading around, which is basically a tradition by which basically in Lombardy, if you get sick, you are very easily hospitalized. And that basically means that during December or January, this may have had an impact in spreading within hospitals the disease. Now, the point we are witnessing now is that for how long can we be locked down without this provoking a major impact on the collective psychology of people, I would say. I was going around yesterday to buy some food, and to be frank...
Can I just pause you a second, just for the benefit of everybody else? I forgot, and I mustn't forget to do this, because we're not in the room, is to introduce yourself. So for those of you who are new...
I'm a member of the parliament in Italy, so I'm quite concerned, not just from the personal point of view. And sorry, yeah. And yesterday I was going around, and I'm in Rome, of course, living in Rome, in a quite crowded area, and it's a ghost town, to be frank. It's quite impressive. You were right, Darmenda. We have never experienced anything of this kind. Now, the point in terms of the balance between, there are two issues I want to raise, and I'll try to stop there. The first one is about what Sebastian was mentioning, about freedoms, human rights, civil liberties, and protection, and reaction to the crisis. And the question I have is whether the model that it was witnessing about contact tracing and the fact that you don't need to go into individual data is something that applies and works irrespective of the stage of the spreading around of the disease of the COVID-19. Because I guess that Sebastian is mostly speaking from a Belgian perspective, and there is a big debate about this in Italy at the moment, of course. And the question is that, does it work, the system that Sebastian was mentioning, only at the very early stage, at a relatively early stage of the spreading of the disease, or you can use it at a later stage, including in Italy? Basically, I mean, going through a use of anonymous data. The second point is that there is a trade-off here, to be frank. People in Italy, many people are respecting the restrictions. We, as member of parliament, are having some problems with that, because it's not a question of taking the measures, it's who is in charge of those measures. And we are asking for the parliament to be convened to basically pass legislation, and even if necessary, even ratify the decisions of the prime minister. And there is a big debate at the moment in Italy, because we are allowing the local authorities to have meetings from remote and formally taking decisions. The European Parliament has announced that they are meeting on the 26th of March to have this kind of meeting. And the Italian Parliament has said, we are not authorized, this is not possible to meet from remote. But that's another story. Now, the point I want to make is very simple. You have to choose. Either you go towards more physical restrictions, which basically means that at some point you force people to stay at home with all necessary means. And we are going very close to something we don't like, because at some point, basically, you will have military people in the streets. And this is already happening in the country, to be frank, and it's quite scary.
And happening in other parts of Europe.
Yes, but we understand it's important. On the other side, you can limit, you can go beyond privacy, to be frank, because life is more important than privacy at this very moment, by saying this data will be deleted once it's over, but you can't have both, because otherwise it becomes too heavily. The other point is about the economic consequences of this. Very simple on this, but there is one issue. I think we are still thinking with the mindset which is the previous world we were in. To give you an example, many people are saying we have to invest, to start public investments again very heavily and massively. That's all fine, but that's for a few months from now. We have to make sure that we are not increasing inequalities and poverty to a level that will be impossible to recover. When we are taking measures now, the government passed a decree with a lot of money trying to support almost everybody, but it was not still conceived as a universalistic system. By simply saying, we need helicopter money. I'm against this. In normal times, I would be completely against this. But these are not normal times. How
Okay.
many irregulars you have? How many people in the black market you have? To be frank, in all our countries, and
Sure.
these people do not exist, and they are staying at home as everybody else at the moment. So
And increasing in their
my
poverty.
problem is social unrest in 1 month time. This is the
Yeah.
issue.
Alessandro, thank you. Thank you for that thought-provoking and thoughtful contribution. I want to bring others in briefly before Sebastian, you make a response, but you raise the issues of governance, because I think there's a question here about how far governance can reach and respond to the situation we find ourselves in terms of passing of emergency legislation and what the impact is on the economics, but also on privacy. Any others that would like to come in from, just very briefly, from your experiences so far, and any thoughts you have, especially some of our, who would like to come? You need to put your hand up. Raise your hand if you want to contribute. I don't believe that. Come on.
I would like to.
Fiori.
You were not
Danai first, and then I'll bring Fiori in as well. Danai, quickly go.
You want to hear my sweet voice, as always. Hello to everybody. I'm happy to see European young leaders from the beginning and the new European young leaders. So it means
Introduce yourself, Danai.
I am Danai Byzantakou. I'm an entrepreneur in shipping and tourism in Greece. And I'm also running two non-profit organizations for empowering women entrepreneurs, small and medium entrepreneurs, and young people, to show them the right path if they want to follow shipping or tourism, which are the two big, let's say, parts of the Greek economy. Greece is also struggling with the coronavirus. Happily, much better than Italy. Of course, we're very much concerned about what's going on in Italy. We're very happy to see that the government finally in Greece is doing better things than the citizens. It's the first time we see this. We're very extremely happy that we had change of the government. This is what we're blessed of, that before coronavirus, we had the chance to change the government. But what I want to say about all this mess that will change completely our lives, because we don't know how to work from home in tourism. I mean, our travel agency and our hotel is closed. They're closed. Our travel agency is open, but if I get the camera to the office next, this is the shipping company, you will see that they're not doing anything. The phones are not ringing, and the next months will be very hard. Our hotel in Zakynthos Island, Zakynthos has 2 of the 6 deaths from the coronavirus in Greece. So our island will not work for this summer, we believe. Already, all the reservations are canceled until June. So if we open in June, we will see what's going on. The good thing is that we see very good points in education. The public schools in Greece work through the internet. So we're very, very happy that this is happening, because all the students, including my daughters, is going to a private school, but although it's a British school, they're working. Although the UK has shown us that they're not so great after Brexit. What I understand is that we see now what we were screaming all these years, including myself. We were saying that Europe is having problem of innovation and of real young, talented people. And what I mean is that now what we face in our companies, in my company at least I see, and speaking with other companies the same, is that we see that the young people have not really understood what's going on, and they don't have plan B. What they care mainly, and please don't be, there is not something that makes me big impressed, because this is happening in most of the companies. The young people are interested if they will lose their summer vacation or not. They don't understand that the whole working experience will change. They don't understand that if they work from home and if it continues, they have to prove they work. Another thing that is very important is that China is buying our shares. I don't know if you see what's going on with the China money, but they're buying many of our company's shares in Europe, and not only.
Of course.
So what I see is that we see all these China things that we were discussing and the talented of the young people, we see that this is happening. And what I believe as an idea is that we must have something as a campaign of what's next, not only the coronavirus. Thank you very much.
No, Danae, and thank you for that. I think there's a fundamental issue here about how do you create capability within institutions and leadership to manage crisis of this nature, because we're going to see more of it. And what we've seen is actually a woeful lack of capacity to actually manage crisis of this kind, especially amongst political leaders, but also administrations. Mark, I'm going to bring you in a moment or two, but before I do, I just wanted to bring in Daria. Daria, where are you? Can I see you? Are you logged on?
Yes.
Hi, Daria. As a new member of the class, welcome.
Thank you.
I was wanting to get your reaction. I mean, you're involved. You know, the founder of Clever Books. We've just heard about education. What's your take in regard to the whole issue of young people in education, but also the role of technology, both in reducing inequalities, but responding to this the pandemic that we are experiencing? Big questions, but any thoughts?
Yes, I have thoughts and I have some answers as well.
Excellent.
Thanks for bringing me in. I was actually thinking about raising the hand because I have some interesting information to share.
Okay.
So, yes, I'm at the New Year, the class 2020, and my company is working in the field of augmented reality and innovation for the education. So we are working on a couple of European Union projects. Hopefully, we will push that innovation in Europe in primary schools. But the interesting thoughts to share is that we are doing a lot of education for the educators themselves, because when we started bringing the innovation to the market, we found out that it was quite hard because people wouldn't understand the innovation itself. And if they don't understand, they just simply don't want to use it and push it back. And we decided, okay, products of innovation is one thing, but we need to educate them on why it's beneficial.
Right.
And while we are doing these educational events and trainings, that's absolutely free of charge for all educators around the world, not only Europe. Yesterday, literally, I was hosting one of the panel discussions. It was a global one. And we invited several principals from different schools. We selected the panel by the following ideas. So one school was closed literally 5 days. Another one was closed 2 weeks, but they were on school holidays. One school was closed 3 weeks, and another one was closed 8 weeks. So, and they were from different parts of the world, from the US to Mongolia. The interesting thing that we asked them to share with other principals and educators who were on the call, what are the main challenges, what technologies they use, and all sorts of things. There are a couple of interesting learning points. Number one, some of them admitted that they were ignoring technology in general, because that was convenient to bring all the kids to school, sit at school, do everything at school, and they didn't consider technology in general as the matter of education and, you know, any vehicle that can actually move something forward. Some of them were using that before, and they are grateful that they started using at least little by little, and that's actually beneficial now. Then there was interesting thing that how they try now to accommodate everyone, because it's one thing to use technology inside the classroom where school can provide some devices and everything, and there's a different thing when there might be a lack of hardware in the house for the kids to learn.
Exactly.
So ideas on how to overcome that, essentially.
Yeah.
There was interesting point about and that Alessandro was actually mentioning that in general public. The same point raised in the school with the principal from Mongolia. They are closed down for 8 weeks already, and there is no potential date on the opening of the school so far.
Right.
And he told, like, the first couple of weeks were kind of fine, and we were using a lot of technology because we used them before, the technology before. and we were providing the education and the teachers were in touch. But on the third week, they have discovered that this lockdown actually created another concern about the health, well-being and mindfulness, and because
Of
people were
course.
down
Okay.
inside their own like close community of family, and they said that it's essential to think in advance, not only about the education as such and provided the material, being in touch,
Yeah.
but also keeping in mind that there might be something connected to the health and well-being.
Sure. I need you to wrap up, but from your experience, and you know, given that you kind of founder of Clever Books, in terms of a kind of a key recommendation, or you know, what the commission could do, from your perspective, I mean, tell us what you very briefly. Is it about making easy access to free technology in people's homes in a way that you might find? I don't know how you get it to market. I don't know, but is that what you're really saying?
What I'm saying that it's better to embrace innovation every day, so you're ready for the times like this in the future.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I need to move on because time is running on so quickly. But Sebastian, I'd like you to come back on some of the issues that have been raised before I bring Mark in. I know that others want to come in now, but I will bring you in accordingly afterwards, I promise you. So, Sebastian, back to you.
Thank you, Dharmendra. So Alessandro really raised some very, very interesting points. And where I'd like to start is, you know, there's often this debate in epidemics or in health crises around the individual's health interests and the public health interests, and they're not always aligned. You know, like when you're an individual, basically you want to make sure that you're safe, that you're close, you know, like your family's safe. And so you're going to want to flee high-risk areas. You will want to have access to the best hospitals, and sometimes even, you know, like you display, you know, like selfish behavior, high-risk behavior, you know, like, or you're just in total denial. You know, like we saw a lot of, you know, like high-risk behavior in the beginning of the epidemic of younger people saying, "Oh well, I don't mind. You know, like this is just like a flu. It doesn't kill people, etc." And so that's an example of the type of behavior you have at the individual level. And this contrasts with the behavior you want to make as a public health official, where you want the epidemic to be stopped as soon as possible. And so there are contradictions between the individual behavior and the you know, like public interest behavior. And these contradictions, for example, are very dire in an epidemic like Ebola, where you have 60% fatality rate. There, the government wants to make very, very strong lockdowns and set quarantine zones that are extremely strict, extremely conservative to really contain the spread of a disease like Ebola. And the individual's behavior within a quarantine zone is survival. And so as an individual, you're going to fight as much as you can to get out of the quarantine zone, because you're going to see that as a death zone, and you're going to see that as a place where you do not want to stay. This is your survival instinct. And so that's, you know, like obviously coronavirus has a much lower fatality rate, but these measures of limiting mobility, considering quarantine zones, create anxiety at the individual level. And that's really one of the challenges that we're confronted with today. One of the, you know, like often I've had the debate with politicians to say, okay, well, do we really need to be targeted? Do we care about being efficient? Because actually we should apply mass measures. We should contain everyone's mobility, etc. And actually both are false. When you take a mass approach, people consider, you know, like, well, this is too extreme. This is not relevant. I'm going to continue to do things. In Belgium, we have lockdown parties, people that continue to organize parties in their houses, and they continue to group up, you know, like, and so that's, although we have mass containment, you still have, you know, like irrational high risk behavior. And if you just do targeted actions of saying, well, I'm going to contain these 10 villages in Italy, well, then you have the other side effect, which is people that are not in the high risk areas continue to behave in a propagative behavior. So you really need both. You need both the mass measure and the targeted measure at the same time to ensure that people really change their behavior. And that's why it's so hard for the moment, because you still have mass pockets of populations that do not change their behavior. So that was the first point I wanted to make to Alessandro, which is individual and public have different interests. There are contradictions. There are psychological, like biases, and that's why data is so important. It's not just important at the beginning of the epidemic. And you were asking the question of, would these still be relevant in Italy? And so the answer is yes, on two levels. First, so the disease spreads in an exponential manner, then it starts to plateau and it declines. These measures are relevant at all three stages. I'll admit that they have different, focuses at each stage. And so in the beginning, it's about limiting the propagation. But once, the disease has spread on so many places, there's no point in predicting propagation because it has propagated everywhere. But, so the use case will change towards, for example, identifying lockdown parties and educating people where those lockdown parties take place, that this is really endangering people's lives. And so what you do at each stage is going to differ, but it's relevant all across. And then the second element is, in the Spanish flu, it was the second wave that was the most deadly.
That's right.
And so for the moment, we only have the hashtag flattening the curve.
Absolutely.
But we don't have the hashtag prevent the second wave.
Precisely,
so that's really where, there's going to be the new focus is going to appear in Italy, probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's going to be, hey, let's make sure that there was only one wave because we've suffered enough already. Do you want me to pause here, Damendra? I had two other points to make.
I really want to bring Mark in, and we've only got about 20 minutes or so left now, unfortunately. Honestly, time rushes really quickly in these circumstances, but do hold your thought. But it does strike me, and I'll bring Mark in on this point, is that no one really knows what they're doing. We don't understand the bug well enough. We don't know about its repeat offendability at this stage, and we don't know how it will cluster around certain age groups. We have no clue. At the moment, we think it's only a certain age group, but we're seeing a rise of, between 25 to 40-year-olds are getting the bug too. What's striking is in the vacuum there is globally, how the EU hasn't stepped in and brought together all its fine capability to really work like a war room kind of situation room, to think about technical capacity, medical capacity, research capacity, and bloody pooling it. And it's a real sense of frustration that they haven't done that. On that point, I want to shift gear over to Mark. Mark, can I bring you in, please? Sure. And we've heard kind of the issues around tech and data. Can you kind of broaden the canvas completely now in terms of your experience so far of what we're learning from the past to inform the present and the future in terms of how inequality is just going to widen and broaden and deepen, if you like?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to join you, and I've enjoyed listening to your comments and interventions. I think it's important, even though many of you will be very familiar with this, to give you very briefly the what, why, and so what of inequality over the past 3 decades. And I can do this quite quickly. The first is that since 1980, we have seen what I would call convergence in a higher amount of income that is clustered in the 1%, and convergence in a lower amount of income that's clustered in the bottom 50%. Right? Different countries in Europe and around the world, for that matter, of course, have different rates. But it is fair to say, as I look at it now, I look at the entire EU, that most of the countries have seen about a 3 percentage point rise in the top 1% and a 3 percentage points fall in the bottom 50%. And that's actually quite a bit. The second thing is the why, and the why starts to get into the issues we're having today. Economists don't fully agree on all of the why, and of course, in each country, there will be some unique aspects to the explanation, but there are 2 big categories. The first would be the global trends that were not necessarily explicit policy choices, but that have had profound changes in inequality that includes the shifting of a lot of manufacturing, the globalization of supply chains, automation in some areas. And the second category is explicit policy choices that were made. And those include changes in the way that we tax, changes in the way that we fund public resources and how much public capital we have. And we can see that both of these, both the global supply chain and the kind of travel that exists today, plus the differences in taxation levels and therefore funding for a number of systems, for example, healthcare systems, easily can be mapped into some of the difficulties, which we would have had anyways, of course, but made even more difficult in dealing with the coronavirus today. Now, so what? Before the virus struck, we had already documented a number of problems that we think are related to these changes in inequality.
Yeah.
They included declines in growth rates. They included changes in the political process and public funding of particular types of systems like education and like healthcare. They included a strong connection that we already knew was there between inequality and health, but now we are documenting even bigger changes in excellent books like The Deaths of Despair and others that have documented rises in decline in life expectancy among certain populations correlated with inequality. And we've also discussed and noted significantly changes in social mobility, which is inequality of opportunity as opposed to inequality in outcome. With COVID-19, we are now, we don't have all the data. I agree with you. We still don't know enough to make all of the claims we'd like to make, but we can make some claims with the data we have, and let me make a few of them. Right? The first is that, in fact, we already know that the virus affects people with chronic conditions more than those without. Right? It's not a matter of catching the virus, it's how the virus affects you. And if you have chronic conditions, particularly lung and others, you have a much higher chance of being hospitalized and potentially dying. And we already know that there is a very steep gradient between income and chronic conditions. So by definition, this is already targeting individuals who are worse off because they are ones who are more likely to be poor, more likely to have these chronic conditions, and therefore more likely to be hit by the virus. The second is we know that the virus feeds off social interaction, right? And that's why we're seeing these policies of containment of one sort or another in isolation. And we know that certain jobs and certain classes of jobs are more able to adjust to this than others, right? Here I am at home. I can almost do everything I need to do from my home office. Many others do not have that option, and that's a function of occupation, of space, of income. You know, France is on lockdown, complete lockdown. However, I would note that this morning my garbage was collected by people who are collecting garbage and are still out there touching everybody's garbage bins. I had 2 Amazon packages delivered, and the checkout workers at food stores are there at work and interacting with people one-on-one as they come through, right? So they are not obviously able to have the same kind of social isolation that professors or other categories of workers can have. The same goes for how much of your job can be related to teleworking, right? I have some data from the labor force survey. We see that obviously there are big differences in who can adjust to teleworking and who can't. Another area, and maybe I'll stop after this to continue the debate, is we had already seen some changes in the labor market that are being sort of blown up in the context of the virus. I had been doing some work on gig economy workers, and I happened to be in the middle of a survey last week with food delivery bikers here in Paris. And so I took the opportunity to throw in some questions on COVID-19 to start to get a sense of what they were experiencing. And probably this is just documenting what you might imagine. Early on, we saw they actually experienced a surge in demand. So they were actually working harder while everybody else was cutting back because food was being delivered more, right? And they were getting lots of text messages from the companies that they work for. They don't really work for them, but the food company, the gig companies telling them to be careful, that this was going on, they should protect themselves. But they noted time and again in these surveys, they were given no opportunity to do so, right? No masks provided, no gel provided, just that, they should be aware, but no resources. After the lockdown took place, these people also are locked down, of course, but they don't have, their zero contract hours, right? They don't have any continuation in pay. They have no opportunity to, you know.
We just lost you. Mark, sorry, Mark, we can't hear you. Mark?
Damendra, I suppose he doesn't have any more batteries in his headphones. That's why he can't hear you.
God, look at you. You have a solution to that. So unfortunately, Mark, I'm not sure whether you can hear me, but we didn't catch the last 60 seconds of what you were saying, but I would remove your headphones. Mark, take your headphones off. Yeah, and just speak into your mic. Can you do that? Okay, while we're dealing with that, let's move swiftly on. We thank you very much. That was very, very thought-provoking and useful in the sense that what this will do is not only reinforce what we're currently witnessing, but actually deepen it. But there's an issue here. I think the question in my mind is, we know that the traditional fiscal and monetary levers aren't going to cut it. Money's almost free to borrow at the moment for everybody, and it's not having an impact on the kind of stock markets. And we know that suddenly governments don't know what levers they should use. Will they be taking an approach to a tax amnesty across the board? Will they forgive the black economy? Because actually, when you think about Europe, most of our cities operate on a black economy. What will happen to all those workers? I want to bring in Dimitri and Nina, who've both had hands up. So Dimitri, ask you to come in first, and then Nina. And then those of you who want to come in, please put your hands up.
Okay, hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to be in this video conference. My name is Dimitri Tsingis. I'm based in Athens, Greece, and I was part of the 2012 class of European Young Leaders. So, and I'm a tech entrepreneur and early stage investor in B2B tech startups. So I would like first to start with a short yet very solid message of optimism. So I don't think we live the end of the world, not at all. It's a big crisis, but we shall certainly overcome it for sure. I'm very confident for that. And I would like to invite you to ask how this hyper-connected social network relates to the amount of misinformation and the amount of panic and the amount of spasmodic reactions we see all around the world and in Europe in particular. So that's very interesting food for thought, because I do think we see a lot of that. So as a first point, I'm very optimistic we shall get over that. The end of the world is not here. The economy will not be destroyed. Everything will go well at the end. But
you'll be forgiven. Sorry, you forgive those who've watched sci-fi, whether they're in their 50s, 60s, or 20s and 15, will feel as if they're watching, they're inside a Netflix serial, and suddenly there's streets and everything is like doom and gloom. So I think you forgive people thinking actually it is the end of the world. But go on, carry on.
No, it's not. And we have to look at the numbers. I tend to believe that so far we have something like 8,000 fatalities or so, okay? Every single death is a strategy, is a tragedy, but, you know, we must look at the numbers. So no, it's not the end of the world, number one. Number two, with every small, you know, catastrophe, right, big or small, the world is moving ahead. And we must look at Europe. So I think we must do some very serious thinking about how real Europe, not the Europe we have in our minds, how the actual Europe reacts to this, you know, to this situation. And it's very disappointing. I mean, it's
precisely. The political leadership has been absent, no?
In 2013, in the European Young Leaders Seminar in Athens, it was mentioned that the European Union back then was counting for more than 50% of the world's social spending. So with something like 6% of the global population, we were paying more than 50% of the world's social spending. Now is the time to see what did we really get with this unprecedented investment. What do we get? In Greece, we get 6 beds of intensive care units every 100,000 inhabitants. I'm afraid that in many European countries, the situation is not much different.
No, absolutely.
So that's extremely disappointing. And we don't have to limit ourselves to the emotional disappointment. We need to be, to seriously think, what can we learn out of this? Because, if you don't pay for something, if you cannot afford something, then okay, you accept the consequences. But,
no, Dimitris,
but paying for this and then not being able to deal with an emergency, to me, it's, calling it others is an understatement. Number one. Number two.
I need you to be brief.
I've been astonished by how different and how not coordinated the European responses are.
Indeed.
That's also insane. So to me, this small catastrophe that we are experiencing, which will not be the end of the world, to me, that's a call for action to really uniting. And, it needs to be a bottom-up movement.
Okay.
We do pay,
I agree.
And, we do pay the funds, but the current structure has a profound, lack of capacity to deal with an emergency. And,
absolutely.
Protecting, I will conclude with that,
Okay.
We keep saying we are proud of the European Union being the largest economy on earth.
Indeed.
But now, we depend on China to send us supplies.
No, indeed. Thanks, Dimitri. You've raised some really interesting points. I think that thing about how do you learn from welfarism and our experience of spending on, the social net, and whether that's been smart given where we find ourselves. That's a really important one in terms of how we look ahead. And actually, when we think about a bottom-up movement, how do you do that when people are in lockdown? And I think we need to think differently about social media platforms and others. I want to move on to people who've been really quite patient so far. So, Nina, I'm going to come to you first.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you. Hello from Stockholm, which is, I guess, an interesting place in these times. Sorry, I should introduce myself.
Please.
2013. I'm a medical scientist by training, not an epidemiologist, but still, and I work as a venture capital investor in life science today. And Stockholm is an interesting place because, of course, we're one of the few countries where there isn't a complete lockdown. But there's a lot of introduced social distancing. And I just wanted to touch upon the role of medical evidence and kind of fact-based decision-making versus political decision-making. And as far as I understood the situation, there isn't a whole lot of evidence supporting the complete lockdown of schools, shutting down of schools, and kind of paralyzing not only the economy, but the access to medical staff and elderly care staff and all those people that are required to support society at large in these very testing times. And I have to say, it's really interesting to see so many politicians across countries taking these very dramatic responses. Let's say Argentina with 600 positive cases and in complete lockdown mode. So it's interesting how we're kind of decoupling facts and political decisions in this stage. And I also want to add to kind of your question around what are the learnings. And I mean, history is written by the winners, so no one here knows where we end and what there will be so many learnings. We don't know what they are yet. But I think, to Dimitri's point and to your point you touched upon from the beginning, I think we will see much more coordination in the area of health across the European Union after this. I take a positive spin. I mean, this has been such a disappointment, as you've touched upon, and I think this will give this will give energy to larger coordination across the European Union in the area of health in general. And to Dimitri's point, I mean, I hear you around, you know, the level of emergency care units. You cannot prepare, you cannot financially support all of that infrastructure for something that happens maybe once in a century, but we can definitely coordinate and have a much bigger collaboration across Europe. And I think that's going to happen after this.
Oh, that's good. It's good to have that positive and optimism, you know. But I agree with you. I hope that you people understand the economies of scale, but also the economies of knowledge sharing by actually having much more of a coordinated health response and a health system for Europe. And hopefully this will be one of the big learnings for the European Union, let alone how it kind of responds collectively and differently to this kind of crisis, which, as I said, I think will continue. I want to bring in two or three others who have been very patient, and I know I'm running out of time. I've only got 7 minutes, but if I can crave your indulgence, we can go to 11. Great, excellent. I've been told by our diva of operations, Natalie, who's on my left-hand side, off camera, that we've got till 11, which is great. God, don't encourage her. Please don't encourage her. You don't see her, but she's already in my ear constantly on the left-hand side. So anyway, it's good to know we can go to 11 o'clock. Ayman.
Yes, hi.
Hello.
Yes, a quick connection from outside the EU, but to tell you specifically on the issue of inequalities, how bad things can be in a country like Lebanon, where historically we've had a pretty good health system. We, before the crisis, we have been going through our deepest economic and financial crisis as a country. The country has defaulted on its foreign debt. Individuals don't have access to their bank accounts except to a very small limit of 400 euros a month. Like things are really, really bad, and we don't have any currencies left in the country to import stuff. There has been a crisis in the medical sector to import basic medical needs and equipment months before the COVID-19 crisis. When the crisis started, we were caught in our religious and sectarian divides to decide whether or not to stop flights from Iran, with a very strong pressure from Hezbollah not to stop it. And the first official cases came from people who were in one of the most infected areas in Iran, coming to Lebanon and bringing the virus. And then now we're caught in a debate whether it's the Jesuit church that actually brought the virus to Lebanon through a number of Jesuit priests who were in Milan before the crisis, and because of social stigma and religious cover, did not reveal the case and infected many people in several parishes. So you have the economic crisis, the religious divisions. Add to it right now the fact that all the private hospitals that are good quality hospitals for 4 weeks refused to treat any case because they didn't want to affect their already difficult economic situation. So every single case was sent to the one big university hospital that is publicly owned, which is not necessarily always very encouraging in Lebanon. They've done a tremendous job and earned the respect of everybody, but it's also showed another side of the inequality divide, where the private sector refused to take any case up until last week. Now only 10 hospitals out of around 80 private hospitals in the country agree to host cases of people with COVID-19. So finally, we're in a situation where the government is in complete bankruptcy and cannot help in any way. At the same time, people who are abroad, Lebanese people abroad, and you know how many of them exist there, cannot receive any aid from their own parents in Lebanon financially because we cannot transfer money abroad. And finally, our National Social Security Fund has invested all its money in government bills, and the government has gone in a complete default mode. So we are relatively dealing with the situation calmly, with around 180 cases and only 4 people dead, unfortunately. But we know for a fact that it's only some kind of chance that is keeping the situation from deteriorating. We do not have any data, any social safety net, and any ability for the government to
Whilst your cases might not be high, but your economy is in free fall.
Absolutely.
I mean, total free fall. And the impact on, communities across the board is fat. But can we ask you, what about neighbors? Like we've talked about how so woefully lacking the EU's response has been to be a collaborative union with purpose and vigor and vim to deal with the situation. What are your neighbours doing in terms of support or not? Is that is this changing the politics around you or not? Or is
We're
just
not necessarily blessed with the most friendly neighbors, as you...
I know, but that's why I ask.
So absolutely. So the borders with Syria has been closed because officially Syria has no case whatsoever of COVID-19. I mean,
come on.
Of course. Yeah. And of course, I mean, the relationship with Israel is not even to be discussed. I mean, we know the situation. The only two countries that have provided technical help were France and China, basically sending masks and suits for doctors in the public hospital. And that's it. Honestly, that's it. There is a very strong media-driven push for lockdown, not necessarily because we have the number of cases that would justify it, but because we know that there is absolutely no way for the government to be of any help beyond just paying the salaries of the doctors at the public hospitals.
But also, I suppose there's a broader question. I won't dwell on this, but if Lebanon goes down, it's going to matter not only to its neighbors, but to Europe and others. So there's something about what kind of different financial perspective we take to aid, but also support, and how this particular crisis is demanding a very different approach to how we deal with our geopolitics, our politics per se, but how we work more in a unified way and treat money differently. But let's see if that ever is borne out in reality in the next 2 or 3 months. I will bring Yoralba in a moment, but Otman, whilst we're in Lebanon, let's move over to Morocco. Where are you? I can't see you on screen. Can you bleep on? Where are you? Otman? Can you hear me? There you go. Have you got your camera on?
He said in the chat that he can't respond right now.
Okay, thank you. All right, don't worry. Let's move to Yoralba.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm Fiora from Albania, and I'm very glad to be in this very informative session. But I'll try to be very short in order to give space to
introduce yourself, because I think we missed it in the beginning. Go on.
So I'm the Deputy Minister of Justice in Albania, and I'm very happy to be here. But I'll try to be very, very fast in order to give enough space to the others, having into consideration the time limits. I have lots of questions about the application that it was introduced, about privacy as well as the way it would function. We are talking about that data, but in order to make use of this data, my first question would be if the application would be obligatory for everyone or voluntarily, because if only some people are using the application, then the data maybe would not be accurate. So I'd like to have some more information about the application, but maybe we don't have time. The question goes to Sebastian. I mean, is there any obligation for everyone to include data, or it's going to be voluntarily? The second,
we can come back to that quickly. Go on, carry on.
What kind of information would people share? I mean, it would be just information about the trajectory, where they go, or even other information about with how many people do they live, if they got the disease or not, any other information. And then going back to the situation in Albania, I heard that there are problems in Lebanon with hospital. Something that we did, because we also have a very not well-organized health system, is to require not only to the private hospitals, but even to the hotels, spaces where we can put people in quarantine in case we need it. And since we had a good response, but not very, very good, the government also has released an order saying that if there would be a need, it's going to be obligatory. I mean, if we would need spaces, then it's going to be obligatory to take hotels or private hospitals in order to lay down people. One point I would have is that what I see is that in the future, maybe the situation is going to bring to more automatization and working online as a risk mitigation. And I can see lots of people going to online session. We currently have online schooling. We have teleworking. And maybe we are also assessing what kind of meetings, maybe our emails. This is a meme that is going around. And we are seeing more and more how many processes could be maybe more efficient if they were online or by using technology. But if we're using more and more technology in somehow automatization, many processes, the question is, what about access to internet? For example, nowadays we have lots of classes going online. In elementary school, in high school, at university are going online as well. We are working in the ministry online. But something, for example, I encounter are people who say, I have no access to internet. I cannot access my email. I cannot access the classes of my children online. And this is going to bring probably to more inequalities. Because if the school are running online, actually, but there are people maybe in remote areas, or there are Roma children who cannot access classes online, we would arrive in a situation that after 3 months, many people have got their information and, I don't know, would appear before an exam, while the other hadn't had anything to do because they did not have access online. And something we're discussing at the level of government is if we can somehow talk with all the operator that in this phase to give to everyone access to internet, and maybe also to consider it as a right, that everyone has the right. And we are like trying to negotiate with all the operators to give access to everyone. So we don't create more inequality in terms of education, but also in terms of working. And with regards to the European Union, since I was having like more time to read, it was, I mean, months I couldn't read. I went back to Jean Monnet. And I'd like to quote only something. I'm not saying that this is for coronavirus, but it's very accurate what he wrote decades ago with the situation.
Who's this?
Here. And I'm quoting very fastly. He says that times has changed. Now we must change our methods, or else stop proclaiming something which we fail to achieve. On all important questions, whether internal or external, the same obstacles arise. Existing European practices have proved inadequate as a means of enabling our countries to organize themselves for collective actions, whether or on monetary affair, on energy, relation with US, and I would also add in here coronavirus. We must break out of this vicious circle in which the common interests of the community countries are inadequately served. The existing European institutions are not strong enough today to do it on their own. And then he goes that the EU is moving very slowly, and he adds, intergovernmental discord, human ill temper, and material confusion might slowly down its momentum, the European momentum, but they could not stop it. That momentum is a complex phenomenon. Everyone had an interest in maintaining it because it offers something he could not afford to lose. So interest in moment of crisis made up of any lack of European team spirit, and no one any longer thought of withdrawing unilaterally or trying to sabotage the whole affair is needed. Indeed, the spirit of Europe is still alive. And I'd really love to see the European spirit still alive in terms of responding to this crisis, in terms of keeping the union together, and also in serving to the European citizens and not just the self-interest of the member states.
And that's good coming from you in Albania, given how you've been treated thus far in the extension process. That's very, very generous of you. Yes. Very generous. But Fiorella, you raised a really interesting point about the potential for how soon will it be that access to the internet becomes a fundamental human right? There, you know, think about that for a moment, because in the context we find ourselves, is that something which becomes conscionable or even thinkable in the context of where we actually find ourselves? But very briefly, if you can be really brief, is that as a government, How are you finding yourselves responding to this? In terms of, you're quite a young government in terms of the demographic to a certain extent, but how does it feel being in this kind of situation, and your colleagues, how are they reacting? Just to give us kind of a view, if you can, in terms of how people are feeling in terms of their sense of confidence, their sense of rabbit in front of headlights, or do they feel, yes, gung-ho, we can tackle this in the Trump way that, I can put a war mentality and we'll win. What's it like in your backyard?
I would consider our country not only young in terms of creation, but also poor somehow comparison with France or Germany. And we are very much aware that we do not have enough monetary resources somehow to respond to crisis. And even our health system does not have scientists like in Germany or maybe in Italy. And this is, again, a situation of inequality where we see countries that have a very strong, robust system of scientists and technology and money. And other countries like Albania, which were not so somehow fortunate due to invasions and other historical elements. What are we doing? Actually, yesterday we released a package with 7 points. And the main message of the Prime Minister is like, we should consider ourselves in this war like we're alone. Like not waiting for the help from the others, but we need to think ourselves in a war where we are fighting on our own and we should do everything on our own. And if help is coming from abroad, of course, it's welcome. But meanwhile, we should also consider everyone's responsibility, be it at the upper level or even at the individual level. And also yesterday, the Prime Minister released a package with 7 points. And these 7 points would help the businesses, where we are going somehow to postpone the fiscal time of declaration and paying fiscal money for the small businesses. We also have a humanitarian package for people that live in rural area or live in the basic income. We're bringing food there.
If I can cut across, I get all of that, and I didn't mean to be cutting across that, because that, I can imagine the responses. I really wanted to understand what it's like around the table as politicians, if you can share. What does it feel like? Are you feeling confident? Is there a kind of sense of, we know what we're doing? Or are you genuinely being open with each other about, my goodness, we really need to make more sense of this? It's trying to get an insight into, but if you can't say anything, it's not a problem.
It's okay. I would say that we are taking this very in a humility, not an arrogant way. And in humility, I think that we're sitting down and striving to each other to find the best solution, seeking for solution in other member states, but also drafting something which is local and responds to our local needs. But I would say that, yes, it's not an easy situation at all. We are not experiencing it as an easy exercise. It's a very hard and challenging time, and everyone is struggling to do his own best, but we're living really in a hard situation. And even the Prime Minister declared that he would not like to be in this situation ruling the country. And I think it's not easy to rule a country when you know that you do not have enough resources. If something goes very, very bad.
Thank you for sharing. We have 10 minutes, I believe, left now. And before I bring in both Sebastian and Mark, just to kind of get some of their general reactions and responses, anybody else wants to come in? Put your hands up, as they say. You're remarkably quiet. I can't believe it. Huh? Christina. Excellent.
Well, thank you. And first of all, nice to meet you all. Yes, it's my first year. I'm from 2020. I'm a social entrepreneur working in innovation in education here in Italy mainly, but also something abroad. Talking about new emerging technologies and also new methodologies for school. And I just wanted to add one question and also a few points about inequalities. The question is about privacy, actually. What I would like to know is what we do after the emergency, because one of my concerns is that, of course, right now there is an emergency, so we are bio-tracking and doing things that we would not do in a normal situation. But my concern is, are we able then to go back to normal, and how? So I was wondering, and I want to ask to Sebastian if they already also thought about how to get back to normal once we hopefully get back also to normal for everything else. So my first privacy concern. And also I wanted to add some points about inequalities, mainly talking about homeschooling, because there are also a lot of people with special needs, for example, who are not really able to follow an online lesson as many are doing. Also, it depends on the age, but talking about high schoolers, for example, if you have special needs, probably you will not be able to follow the lessons as everybody else. It's not easy to see if the parents are trained enough in order to help kids who have special needs. And sometimes also school is very useful because some students can get out of their homes and get to a healthier environment, which is now something that cannot do because they're staying at home, and it's not the best situation for them. So there are also some small parts of the population who right now will, have a more inequality, and he will spread more. And also, of course, migrants, refugees, homeless people, there are a lot of parts of the populations who right now probably are those who will pay the worst price in this situation. So that is also something we should look at when we talk about inequalities, I think.
No, absolutely. You raise it. I mean, there is this thing about the impact of the lockdown in terms of, what does it do to volunteering? Much of the communities that we're talking about at the sharpest edge rely on voluntary effort and civil society organizations who cannot run in the normal way that they have been doing up to this point. And how do we think differently about our response? When you talk about when we go back to normal, you've probably read a lot that, people are saying there is not going to be a return to normal. This is the new normal. And perhaps we're going to have to reshape everything from our economics, politics, and how we learn and work fundamentally, because this is only one in a series of crises that we're likely to meet. But I don't think we can even countenance that at this stage. I want to bring in, I think Mary wanted to come. Thank you very much for that. And we'll bring in our two speakers for concluding remarks. And thank you very much, and welcome to the class of 2020. Mary, you wanted to come in, and I wanted to make sure that, Jamila and Katie, I thought you wanted to come in early. If you don't want to, don't worry, but I am running out of time, so I want contributions to be quite brief. So Mary.
Good morning, all. Just very quick.
Hello, welcome.
Thank
Do you introduce yourself, Mary?
Sure. My name is Mary Fitzgerald. I'm Irish. I live in France and I work on Libya. I'm a mix of journalist, researcher, and several other things. And I've been part of this network since almost the beginning. And just a reminder to people, the network is now almost a decade old, and we have hundreds of alumni across Europe. And that basically leads me to the point I wanted to make. I think, this really is a moment where our world is being remade in front of our eyes. Our continent is being remade, and the impact of this moment, economically, socially, politically, is huge. And we're watching all of that in real time. And living in France and being on lockdown, we're now on the 4th day, just looking at how, all kinds of questions in terms of a new sense of the collective, but also a sense of the individual. So collective responsibility, individual responsibility, but also this question of who's going to benefit from this moment politically across Europe. Whether this is something that the populists, the ultranationalists will take advantage of, the whole question and idea of borders. Macron told us the other day, this is a virus that knows no borders. Yet we're still seeing member states in Europe trying to put up borders physically and metaphorically. And I guess the point I wanted to make was, you know, how there's a responsibility here, I think, to build buffers as we go along through this moment. And this question of how we can draw on the very rich, very deep and wide network we have now of hundreds of people working in different sectors, areas, backgrounds, etc., across Europe, to start building that new sense of solidarity, start fostering that new sense of solidarity that we're going to need. And, you know, away from this conversation from an institutional level, etc., governmental level in Europe, what can we all, the hundreds of us in this network and our extended networks beyond EYL, do to forge this? Because I think if you're not working in institutions or governments, you might be feeling a little helpless now. But this question of how different people can contribute within this network to encourage or foster that sense of solidarity.
Thank you, Mary, for reminding. And I want to end on that point after I ask our contributors to respond to the points that have been made. And sorry, as we are running out of time, I can't bring anyone else in, but I want to bring in Sebastian and then Mark. Sebastian, first over to you. If you can be brief in responding to some of the very specific questions that Fiora raised, but also what others have raised also in terms of the transferability of what you're doing to a certain extent as well.
Sure. So really great questions. Thank you, everyone. So the flow I'll follow is the following. So Alessandro asked, okay, who calls the shots? And so in our case in Belgium, it's undeniably the government who receives the confidence of Parliament and who is still controlled by independent parties, administrations, and in our case, it's a data protection authority. And so I don't think governments should be using the situation of crisis or emergency or state of emergency in order to do whatever they want. That's what's been unfortunately happening in Israel. I think we should do something else. But so that's my first point. The second point from Fiori around, okay, well, what data is collected and shouldn't we be thinking about opt-in? You know, like the best data you can imagine to combat a disease like this is high frequency location, it's social graphs, and the downside is that this best quality data to combat the disease is also the most private. You know, like, and so the whole notion that you're bringing, which is, could we leave this data aside and then just rely on self-reporting or opt-in, is unfortunately, in my opinion, something that we've missed. If we had had the system in place, if we had had, let's say, the framework to kind of be able to rely on this self-reported data, opt-in data, that would have been fine, but it's too late. And the time it's going to take to set up the system is going to be 3-4 weeks, and then we're going to be in another set of discussions. And I'm not even going into the debate on whether opt-in is sufficient and will people, you know, like convert and provide the data that's needed. And so rather than working on trying to build a new system, we've tried to say, let's work with the current system, with the current existing data, and have a phased approach. When Alessandro was saying, well, shouldn't we be favoring life over privacy, I think is too early a trade-off. I would rather say, let's balance life and privacy. And we can do that with the current system, the current legal framework, the current data, and do that in a phased approach. And if we see that it's not enough, then we can go further into saying, okay, well, let's go more in favor of efficiency and hence lives, and then be very conscious of the costs we're taking in regard to privacy. And then just to close, Christina was asking, well, after the emergency, will there be a possibility to go back to a normal situation? I liked your answer, Damendra, of saying this is going to be a new normal. That's true. But I think it's let's stop going into the fear discourse of now Europe, because of coronavirus, we're going to become an authoritarian state. We're going to let go of all of our privacy values. That's clickbait. That's working very well on the internet for the moment. Like that is not what's happening. The legal framework is extremely robust. They're, you know, like all the things you've heard about GDPR are being enforced. There are exceptions foreseen in GDPR for public health matters. And so we are working in a very safe environment. And the responsibility of preventing authoritarian states to be elected is our responsibility as leaders, as citizens, as voters. And that's what we need to continue to communicate across the media. But I do not see this as being the 9/11 against privacy rights. These are very, very catchy statements. But for the moment, they're utilized for political means and for fear mongering. And so I refuse to enter that type of discourse.
No, points well made. And I think that you're right. The mentality of, you know, I mean, it's absolutely acceptable that people are feeling a sense of fear and panic, because it does feel as if you're in some sort of film that you've never experienced before, and it's actually happening around you globally. So you can understand that. But you know, your point is absolutely right, that needs must. Sometimes we need to act in a way that balances both rather than either or, in terms of, you know, privacy and human rights and making sure that we create a safer world and actually get through this. But the point that you make about data is, in reality, it's been privatized. Those of you who've got your GPS data on your phone, and what we know about Facebook has done with data, they know all this already, and it's currently privatized. And, you know, we need to think differently about the fact that we're living in that reality where actually some of the largest platforms know exactly what we're doing and where we are at any time of the day. Mark, over to you for final comments.
Sure, and I assume you can now hear me again.
Yes, thank you.
The comments I would make, thank you for your responses. I mean, I would say two things. The first is we probably need to separate the economic impact of this event, which is now large and certain. No matter what else happens from here, the economic impact is already enormous, versus the health impact, which in some regions is large, others we don't know how large it's going to be, but these are different and both important. When it comes to inequality, the key is, for these impacts, the distribution of the impact versus the aggregate impact. Even when the aggregate impact seems manageable, it may be the case, and it clearly is the case in some areas, that the distribution of that impact affects certain types of workers, certain types of people, certain countries in Europe much differently, and we have to keep that in mind as well. The last point I would make is on surge capacity in public systems, and one of the real clear things for me that I want to keep working on after this event is understanding exactly how we manage surge capacity in public systems, because where I really disagree is that we're planning for things that happen every 1,000 years. In fact, in the last 2 decades, we've had 3 or 4 surges that have caused various degrees of difficulty in our public systems, and clearly we haven't prepared properly for that.
Thank you very much. And I think on that point, it goes back to what Mary was saying, and I want to conclude on this actually, is that we have the most fabulous minds around on this screen, but also those who are not here, and the alumni that we have. And I wonder if, you know, we are, you know, the call out from us at Friends of Europe to you is, help us write what we should be thinking about in terms of, when you say surge capacity, you know, Mark, you're absolutely right. How do you think create a different kind of story of public sector capability? How do you create a different kind of narrative about the modern leadership that we need, political and otherwise, in managing crisis? What kind of new underpinning philosophy or a model do we need for economics? When we think about how markets have reacted, we cannot continue like that. So what kind of new economic model should we be moving to? When we think about health systems, we know that the current system will not sustain itself and cannot respond to the kinds of crises that are likely round the corner. What's the future health system we should be looking at? But thinking from it, not necessarily from a classic government support, tax-funded approach. What other models could there be? So our invite to you is that those of you who want to work with us in this coming period is help us build a different kind of narrative of what, not, I don't like the new normal, but one of the things that we have to learn from this is that, as we said in the beginning, this has been the biggest catastrophe and emergency since post-World War II, if you like. And that gave birth to a number of ideas in terms of how the role of state should operate, the concept of welfareism, and a whole range of economic models, both municipally run and in relation with the private sector. It seems to me that we have a moment now to really rethink some of those, and it's urgent to rethink some of those, and we would like to do that with you. So thank you all, thank our contributors, and thank you all for being here. I just want to ask if you can, through a show of hands, let us know, has this been okay? So if it's been okay, excellent. Fairly easy, fairly straightforward? You'd come back? You'd come back? Excellent, that's what we wanted to hear. Well, listen, thank you all. This has been quite a challenge. I hope it's been, you know, as I said, you've said it's okay. So that's good, gives me a little bit of confidence that we're going to do this again. I have to say it's quite odd. I've got all these screens everywhere, and I hope that it's been all right in terms of managing it, managing the process. But it's been lovely to see you all. It really has, new and old, if I can call you that. And we'll be in touch. Be safe, take care of yourselves and your families and your loved ones, and see you again, I hope, very, very soon in the near future. But we'll put out the call to you, as I've just said, about how do we help, you know, write a different kind of narrative for Europe and further afield as we move to our State of Europe in October. Take care, lots of love. Bye-bye.
Ciao, everybody.
Ciao.